Hi, and welcome to this follow-up video of the presentation that you have just watched. I thank you for watching it. I appreciate you paying attention. And this video is more or less a summation of the discussion that I conducted after I had originally given this presentation several weeks ago to some fellow students, some international students. And the first question that I had posed, would you raise your children bilingually, more or less reached a consensus. Everyone, if they had the opportunity, would raise their children bilingually. The second question, however, what are some of the benefits and or drawbacks to raising their children bilingually, was what received the most attention or received the most comment. One benefit that one student mentioned was that they would have cross-cultural experiences, the children would. If, for example, the parents were of different nationalities or ethnicities, this would allow their children to experience two cultures in one household. On the flip side of that, or on the other side of the sword, is that there would perhaps maybe be an identity crisis within the child because they would not be sure what nationality or ethnicity or culture they relate with more. Another comment that I'd received was that their children would have an accented English because the parents would be learning English as a second language learner and their children would then have an accent, perhaps. And what some parents might be concerned with is, will this put my child at a disadvantage academically, socially, in whatever way? And another comment that actually I found very interesting when I first heard it was that many Arabic parents who are coming here to ISU, for example, or to a university, they're coming and leaving their children at daycare, and what they're finding is their children are receiving more or less an imbalance of their two languages. So they're receiving more exposure in English rather than in their native or heritage language. And when I then posed the question, would you still raise your children bilingually should you find out they had autism? This depends, because autism spectrum disorder, as the name implies, it is a spectrum. There are cases that vary all over the map, and there is no one-size-fits-all answer. And from my own personal experience, I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was more or less 2 or 3 years old. However, I didn't grow up bilingually. That being said, I still am a language learner, and I've been studying Spanish for more or less 10 years now and slowly studying an additional language, that being Italian. And unfortunately, the reason why most of these studies have been done on ages more or less 3 to 8 years old is because this is when autism manifests itself the most. This is the time when most parents can notice it. And for the kids, it depends on the severity, or the children, because autism spectrum disorder is a range, there are some autistics who are unable to speak. And fortunately, because of technology, we have many applications that allow, or apps that allow our children to speak audibly through some form of communication. And the reason why perhaps this study did not include the children, because this study that I presented only included the mothers, or the parents, in this case the mothers, it could have been perhaps that their severity of autism was to the point where they could not speak. So, would children be raised the same way if they were bilingual and autistic? It's possible, although I would argue that, and what I mentioned during the presentation was that it's possible that the parents would code switch. So, for example, they would be speaking to their child in English, and then all of a sudden switch to Chinese because they're seeing their child have confusion and have some problems. And perhaps one question that was raised that I had actually not considered when I first gave this presentation was how their definition of bilingualism was set. Because it seemed that they thought that the brain was one thing and that there were two languages. There wasn't really a set ratio of 1 to 1, it was 1 to 2. And that was an interesting comment that was made that I actually had not considered. And another colleague or fellow audience member asked me, how can we help adult autistics in an education setting, whether it's with language or just in general? And what I had found was that the reason it was more or less referring to, it was going back to my original reason for doing this research, which back in 2007, a study done by George Washington University found that autistics more or less make up 2% of the college population. And once they arrive, if they're going for a 4-year degree, they have an 80% chance of dropping out before they complete it. So I found that to be very, very serious. And the fact that I, as a graduate student, and as an autistic, and as a language learner, to make it this far is still a mystery to me. But one thing that I had not mentioned in my presentation that I actually did follow as sort of a follow-up was that technology has allowed us to see if the brain, for example, is showing itself to have one specific area for language learning or just learning a language in general. And one article from The Guardian recently said that they conducted MRI scans. A Swedish institute conducted MRI scans. And what they found was that there are specific parts of the brain that light up when someone is learning a language, while others remain inactive. Now, what parts of the brain, the article didn't state. But it also, these parts of the brains also lit up when when the students or participants were engaged in specific activities. So, for example, making distinguishments between the L and the R sounds. And for myself, what I had felt that needed to be done, because I also wanted to add this during the presentation, was I felt that more research obviously needs to be done. And if I was going for a doctorate degree or postdoctoral work, I would want to engage several researchers and with them conduct longitudinal studies of both male and female, so boys and girls, autistic language learners from the time they are of this age group, so 3 to 8 years old, to the time they at least arrive to the first year of college. Because when I was doing this research, it frustrated me to know that there really is very little to no research whatsoever on adult autistic language learners. And unfortunately, I think this is because of the fact that of this 80% dropout rate, which I mentioned before. And another question that was proposed to me during this presentation was, how can we help, or what's the advice I could give to adult fellow novice instructors or current instructors as to how best to deal with autistic language learners, or just autistics in general. And what I said is to have patience. We do want to make ourselves known, and we are trying to communicate, but it's oftentimes we need more time, and the instructors need more patience. This is crucial for any language, for any person, but it's particularly of great interest and of importance for those who are autistic. And the second thing that I had said was that to not buy into the stereotypes. Unfortunately, the media in recent years has painted a very dark color for autistic language learners, and just autistics in general, and those who have Asperger's. So my advice is to have patience and to not give in to the stereotypes, because who knows, we just might surprise you and impress you. So I thank you again for watching this follow-up video and the presentation in the beginning.